Hi everyone, Peter here from Movement and Performance, and in this presentation we're going to be covering contrast training. So we're going to be covering what contrast training is, why it can be beneficial when we're training for our athletes, and then how can we best implement that to get the most out of it. So contrast training is essentially when we perform two exercises in succession that have contrasting or very different loads. So one really heavy and then one really light. And this takes advantage of the post-activation potentiation effect, which we'll cover in a second. So essentially we have an exercise like a back squat, and then we have a rest period and then a box jump, then a rest, back squat, rest. So it's almost like a superset, but there is rest in between each set. So the post-activation potentiation phenomenon is basically when we use a conditioning exercise, which is basically a heavier loaded exercise that is basically trying to improve the subsequent exercise that we're doing. So like we had in this example, we had a back squat and that was the conditioning exercise so that the box jump, we can perform the box jump even better. So the conditioning exercise that we use is generally very heavy, and then the exercise we're trying to improve is usually very light. However, there has been some recent research showing that the effects can actually work the other way, so a very light and explosive exercise can actually also potentiate a heavier exercise. So the light exercise can potentially be used as an exercise to potentiate a heavier exercise. However, it's not recommended at this stage. So how does the post-activation potentiation work? Basically, when we do a really heavy or high effort exercise, such as a heavy back squat, we stimulate the nervous system and we recruit these really high threshold motor units. And then when we have those motor units recruited, so we can recruit more muscle fibers, they are able to then be recruited in the following exercise. So if we do that back squat like we had earlier in that example, we recruit these very high threshold motor units. We can then use all those high threshold motor units to maximum ability in the following exercise that we do, even though theoretically they should be activated anyway. But I guess the post-activation potentiation ensures that we get sort of that maximum, the maximum amount of motor unit recruitment out of these high threshold motor units. And this then allows us to perform almost super maximally, in a sense, for a short period of time following the conditioning exercise. So we can actually perform better in an explosive exercise if we use one of these conditioning exercises before that explosive exercise, and we can actually perform that better than if we didn't have a conditioning exercise at all. So the specifics of contrast training, basically when we're talking about the exercises that we want to use, we want similar force vectors. So for example, a hip thrust and a horizontal jump could work because they're both horizontal force directions, or then something like a squat and a vertical jump because they're both vertical force vectors. There has also been research on very heavy sled pulls, which can be used as a post-activation potentiation exercise for unloaded sprinting, and has shown some slight performance improvements. So when we're selecting loads for our contrast training, our conditioning exercise, we want to be very heavy, so we want more than 80% of the 1RM for the conditioning exercise, and then our actual follow-up exercise, we want to be very light and explosive. So something like if we do something like a hip thrust, very heavy, then we want something very light like a horizontal jump for the next exercise. And I guess this is where the name contrast comes from, and the closer we go to each other, so if we have lower load as a conditioning exercise and a higher load as a following exercise, the potentiation effect is likely going to be reduced the closer and closer we get to each other in terms of these two exercises. When we talk about volume, we want low volumes because this is going to allow us to not have excessive fatigue buildup, and it's going to allow us to perform each rep in each set with high quality. So recommendations can be about 2 to 3 sets of about 1 to 5 reps. Any more than that, and you're probably going to run into some fatigue issues. When we have rest periods in between each exercise, up to 8 minutes is probably optimal. However, practically that's not really a viable option. So practically speaking, we recommend greater than 2 minutes rest at least. So this is basically an example of how we could implement contrast training in an actual session. We want to make sure that we implement it in a phase of training that we're working on these explosive qualities and these heavy loads as well, so that we can train both the strength and the power exercises in the one session. So an example could be front squats, 3 reps at 85%, and then 3 minutes rest, and then 3 max effort drop jumps onto a box or something. And then we repeat that again, 3 minutes rest, front squat, 3 minutes rest, drop jump, and however many sets is required, then you can perform that many sets. However, we've got to make sure that if quality starts reducing, we probably want to cut the session there. So speaking of keeping the quality high, we want to make sure that the athlete feels fresh for every single rep and every single set that they perform. And the reason for this is that if we start getting fatigued, it can reduce the quality of the work we're doing, and that sort of defeats the whole purpose of using contrast training in the first place. We want to use the contrast training so that we can perform with higher qualities than we normally can and higher intensities. So if we start fatiguing, we're going to reduce that quality and defeat the purpose of using this strategy in the first place. So we can accumulate too much fatigue by having too little rest between each exercise, or having too much volume, and that can mean too many sets, that can mean too many reps. But essentially, if we do too much, our fatigue is going to start accumulating and our quality is going to go down. So a good way to do it may be to have a cutoff. If you have the appropriate monitoring tools, a 5 or 10% cutoff in whatever exercise you're doing may signal the end of the contrast training. That's it for this presentation. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like this informative content, you can follow Movement and Performance on Facebook and Instagram with the links here. And if you haven't already, feel free to subscribe on YouTube for updates on further videos. So on Facebook and Instagram, you'll find the latest research summarized into these easy to read infographics so that you can stay up to date on the latest research in sports performance training. You'll also find training videos of a range of different athletes. Thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully you got something out of it.